December 17, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The cold is absolute, a metallic kind of cold that bites through steel and skin alike. The dawn doesn't rise, it bleeds slowly through the fog. The world is silent except for the shallow cough of an engine trying and failing to come alive. Inside his Tiger tank, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper leans over the instrument panel. The Maybach HL-230 engine, 700 horsepower of German engineering, sputters once more, then dies with a long mechanical sigh. A red warning light flickers on the dashboard. Fuel exhausted. Peiper stares at it for a long second, then slams his fist against the steel bulkhead. "Verdammt!" The word echoes in the frozen compartment. His driver, Rotenführer Kurt Werner, doesn't look back. He already knows. The reserve tank is dry too. Outside, the cold air stings like acid. Peiper climbs out of the turret, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Around him, an entire armored spearhead, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, 5,000 men of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, sits motionless in the fog. Engines dead. Exhaust trails frozen mid-breath. A graveyard of machines. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls. Or maybe it's just a soldier shouting orders in the mist. The forest absorbs the sound. Peiper walks along the line of tanks, his breath clouding in the air. The smell of oil and frost hangs thick. A crewman wipes his hands on a rag, muttering prayers to engines that won't start. The mechanized fist of the Reich. Paralyzed. Then a call comes from the forward scouts. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, amerikanische Stellung." Peiper looks ahead. Through the mist he sees it. A cluster of low wooden buildings, a few sandbag walls, a scattering of abandoned jeeps. Smoke rises lazily from a barrel fire. The Americans have fled, leaving their breakfast steaming on tin cups. He orders a patrol forward. The men move cautiously, rifles ready, boots crunching through the snow. The first soldier pushes open a door. Inside, maps, crates, the lingering smell of coffee. The second soldier shouts something, a note of disbelief. "Benzin! Herr Obersturmbannführer, Benzin!" Peiper strides into the clearing, his breath turning to fog. What he sees freezes him mid-step. Rows upon rows of jerry cans, stacked 3 meters high, stretching hundreds of meters into the distance. American fuel. Thousands of containers, marked in black stencil, U.S. Army gasoline, 80 octane. The numbers run through his head automatically. Each can, 5 gallons. Each row, hundreds. Each stack, thousands. 50,000 gallons. Perhaps more. Enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse and beyond. Enough to change the course of the offensive. The men cheer. Laughter ripples through the ranks. Someone shouts, "God himself fights for Germany." Others rush forward, unscrewing caps, pouring the fuel into their tanks. The air fills with the sweet, chemical scent of high-octane gasoline. Engines begin to roar back to life, coughing and bellowing like awakened beasts. For the first time in days, Peiper allows himself a smile. The gods have given him a gift. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, approaches, grinning like a man reprieved from the gallows. "Enough to reach Antwerp twice over," he says. "The Americans must have run in panic." Peiper doesn't answer. He's looking at the labels, at the neat, factory-perfect rows of cans. at the way they're stacked. Organized, industrial, effortless. He imagines the journey. Oil drilled in Texas, refined in Louisiana, shipped to New York, then to Liverpool, across the Channel, through France, and into these hills. All in weeks. He opens one of the crates left behind. Inside, manifests, shipping logs, typed in English. He can read enough to understand. Dates, quantities, origins. 6,000 miles. 6 weeks. His smile fades. Gruber is still talking, still jubilant, but the words fade to a hum. Peiper feels the weight of the papers in his hand. Each line a sentence in the death warrant of the Reich. If the enemy can abandon this, he thinks, what can't they do? He looks around. The soldiers are laughing, refueling, shouting to each other in relief. It feels like salvation. But to him, it feels like a funeral. The fog thickens. Somewhere nearby an engine backfires, echoing like a gunshot. Peiper flinches, his instincts still tuned to the front. He kneels beside a fuel can and stares at the stamped lettering, Made in USA. How much of this do they have? The question gnaws at him. 50,000 gallons. To the Americans, a rounding error. To him, a miracle. To Germany, a myth. He remembers the last briefing at Tondorf 2 days earlier. General Sepp Dietrich's voice, blunt as a hammer. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse, if you capture it. Peiper's division had been allocated 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles. The Meuse was 65 miles away. He had known the math didn't work then. Now he knows it never could. The war's outcome had been written not in courage or tactics, but in gallons. The sound of engines now fills the air again. His tanks refueled, ready to move. But he knows what it really means. They will drive on, yes, but every mile will take them deeper into the proof of their defeat. He looks east, toward Germany, where the factories burn and the refineries lie in ruins. Then west, toward the Americans, whose supply lines stretch like arteries across a continent. For a long moment he says nothing. Then, quietly, to no one in particular. If they can leave behind what we guard with our lives, then this war is already lost. The wind picks up, scattering papers across the ground. One of them catches on a jerry can, its heading clear in the morning light. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, Supply Depot 99th Infantry Division. Peiper stares at it until the fog swallows it again. Engines rumble. Orders are shouted. The column begins to move. But as the first Tiger tank lurches forward, Peiper doesn't climb aboard. He stands among the fuel cans, surrounded by abundance that isn't his, and feels smaller than he ever has. The forest echoes with the roar of engines burning American gasoline. It sounds like victory, but it smells like defeat. To understand why Joachim Peiper's miracle at Honsfeld was an illusion, you have to step back from the frozen Ardennes and look at the entire war as a machine, one fueled by petroleum. By late 1944, Germany wasn't fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting for fuel. 6 months earlier, Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, stood before Hitler in the Wolf's Lair, holding a report that should have ended every offensive plan still on the table. The Leuna hydrogenation works, once producing 175,000 tons of synthetic fuel a month, was down to 5,000. The Burgos and Perlitz plants were smoking craters. Allied bombers had learned to follow the smell of gasoline. The statistics on the paper were clinical, bloodless, but they told a story more terrible than any battle report. Germany's total fuel production, including captured Romanian oil and synthetic fuel, amounted to 33 million barrels a year. The United States, that decadent plutocracy Hitler despised, was producing 1.8 billion. America was not fighting with soldiers. It was fighting with wells, pipelines, and refineries. That ratio, 50-1, wasn't just arithmetic. It was destiny. The Wehrmacht still moved with the discipline of 1940, but its backbone was rotting. Across Europe, horse-drawn wagons carried ammunition for jet-age fighters. The proud panzer divisions of Guderian's legend now shared the roads with oxen carts and bicycles. Every offensive had to begin with a fuel prayer. Can we even get there? Meanwhile, the United States was drowning in petroleum. The East Texas oil field alone outproduced all of occupied Europe. Refiners in Louisiana were experimenting with gasoline additives simply because they had too much crude. The contradiction was almost biblical. One empire starved under the shadow of abundance. Speer had warned Hitler that his armies were operating on fumes. Hitler refused to listen. He didn't understand fuel. He understood will, heroism, ideology, but not logistics. He believed war could still be won by faith and aggression. The Americans knew better. By 1944, the U.S. Army's logistics network had become a living organism. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system of 6,000 trucks, ran day and night, burning 40 gallons per vehicle daily. The operation itself consumed more fuel than an entire German army group, and yet it fed the front with 12,000 tons of supplies every 24 hours. Food, ammunition, and above all, gasoline. Then there was Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. From the beaches of Normandy, a network of undersea pipes carried 1 million gallons of fuel every day across the English Channel. By autumn, those pipes connected to an inland web stretching all the way to Paris. American soldiers joked that they could drink water from the tap and it would taste like gasoline. In contrast, the Germans had no real fuel network at all. They relied on trucks that burned more than they carried. Trains ran on coal because there was no diesel. Fuel trains from synthetic plants had to sneak across bombed railways at night. Every drop that reached the front was a miracle of improvisation. In Berlin, Albert Speer stared at maps that told a truth the generals refused to see. Germany's armored might, the myth of Blitzkrieg, had been built on a resource it no longer possessed. He once said, "Every tank is a prisoner of its fuel supply." By 1944, every tank was already in captivity. On the Eastern Front, panzer divisions sat immobilized while Soviet T-34s rolled forward, fueled by endless convoys from the Caucasus. Pilots grounded their aircraft, not from defeat, but because there was no aviation gasoline. The Luftwaffe's training schools cut pilot hours from 250 to 60. The next generation of aces would never take off. And in the West, even as Hitler plotted his grand Ardennes counteroffensive, his generals whispered that the numbers didn't work. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, would require 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. The army had 2.5. The plan depended entirely on capturing American fuel. It was less a strategy than a confession. In the German mind, the offensive was one last roll of the dice. But the dice were already loaded with arithmetic. Across the Channel, in England, warehouses overflowed with supplies. American planners thought in millions, millions of gallons, millions of shells, millions of meals. They measured not by need but by logistics. Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion wrote in his diary on December 16th, "Fuel resupply today, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity." He didn't realize that his casual note was a sentence of death for thousands of German soldiers. By the time Peiper's tanks rolled through the Ardennes, the contrast between the two empires had become surreal. On the German side, empty barrels, cold engines, and horses dragging fuel carts through mud. On the American side, roaring convoys, engines idling in long queues, drivers complaining about boredom. Every drop of fuel that powered a Sherman tank had traveled from Texas oil fields to Atlantic refineries, across oceans, through pipelines, onto ships, then trucks, then jerry cans. Tens of thousands of miles of logistics that worked flawlessly. It was the most complex supply chain in human history, and it was invisible to those it crushed. To Peiper's men at Honsfeld, that invisible empire materialized as a wall of fuel cans, stacked in perfect order, waiting like a message from another world. Fuel had become the true currency of power. The Americans could waste it. The Germans could only worship it. In December 1944, a single American armored division consumed 25,000 gallons a day. Peiper's entire regiment had received 31,000 gallons for the offensive. Total. The mathematics of failure were inescapable. And yet, the Germans still believed. They believed because belief was all that remained. On December 16th, as Peiper's tanks rolled westward, the offensive began with thunder. The artillery barrage that opened the Battle of the Bulge was immense. More shells fired in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had used in some entire campaigns. But the thunder was hollow. For every shell launched, for every tank that advanced, another drop of fuel vanished forever. At first, the offensive seemed to work. American lines broke, towns fell, prisoners were taken. But every mile forward drained Germany's lifeblood faster. By the time Peiper reached Honsfeld and found his miracle, the offensive was already doomed. His discovery didn't save the Reich. It exposed its delusion. 50,000 gallons. Enough to fill every tank in his column. Enough to feel, for one morning, invincible again. But compared to the oceans flowing through Allied pipelines, it was nothing. While the SS poured American fuel into their tanks, American engineers were opening new pipelines, building new depots, laying new roads. They were creating abundance faster than Germany could destroy it. The war was now a matter of arithmetic. At 7.5 million gallons consumed daily, the US Army could afford to lose 8 million and not even notice. Germany, with 5 million allocated for the entire offensive, could not afford to lose a drop. Fuel had become theology. America's God was abundance. Germany's was scarcity. Peiper, standing amid the rows of jerrycans, understood it instinctively. He was a soldier trained for tactics, but he had stumbled upon the real battlefield, the economy of supply. The men who built those cans, the welders and dockhands in Texas, the mechanics in Liverpool, the truckers of the Red Ball Express, they were his true enemies. They were the army that would bury the Wehrmacht. The German High Command still spoke of courage and fate. But on the ground, in the frozen Ardennes, the truth was simpler. Tanks without fuel were monuments, not weapons. In Berlin, radio broadcasts spoke of heroic resistance. In the field, soldiers siphoned the last fumes from abandoned vehicles, pouring them into jerry cans like liquid hope. Each can became a symbol, 5 gallons of faith against an empire of oil. But faith burns faster than gasoline. The road into Stavelot twists through black trees and white fields. Fresh snow deadens sound. It also swallows tracks. German half-tracks stumble forward like blind animals, snouts steaming, clutches protesting. Men ride the fenders and hold their breath. Every stall costs gasoline they do not have. Peiper studies the sky between the branches. Smoke smudges the horizon, thick and oily. Not battle smoke, something larger. He orders speed. Engines answer like thirsty throats. The column surges. The first American sign appears at a crossroads. A nailed plank with a hand-painted arrow, gas dump. It points toward a low valley ringed with trees and old stone walls. Through the trees, the smoke rises like a cathedral spire. The men taste it before they see it. Sweet, acrid, unmistakable. Gasoline. They round a bend, and the world turns to fire. Stavelot's fuel depot stands on 15 acres of snow, no longer white. Jerry cans are stacked in pyramids, aisles running between them like streets. They are burning, thousands upon thousands of 5-gallon cans howling as they burst. A sheet of flame tears at the sky. Heat slaps faces at 200 meters. The air roars like a furnace door opening on the sun. American engineers move like shadows through the blaze, tossing white phosphorus grenades, dragging hoses of fire across the snow to stitch the rows together. Every grenade writes another orange paragraph. Every paragraph becomes a book. The depot burns as if it has always been burning and always will. Peiper's lead tigers grind to a stop. Men stare through blackened goggles. Someone laughs, too high, almost a sob. Another man takes a step toward the flames before a sergeant drags him back. "You'll boil in your boots," he growls. The wind shifts. A wave of heat punches across the road and men drop to their knees. Paint blisters on fenders. Machine gun belts hiss like snakes. A sign at the depot gate flashes in the firelight. U.S. Army gasoline. Below it, a chalkboard scrawl, yesterday's inventory, numbers so large they look like jokes. 2,189,000 gallons. The chalk runs as the board chars, the digits bleeding down the wood like tears. Peiper watches an American officer on a truck bed raise his arm. A dozen engineers yank the pins on grenades and fling them into an untouched block. White suns pop. Another wall of fire blooms. A gust of wind carries the smell of raw fuel, hot paint, scorched rubber, charred wood. The engineers do not look at the Germans at the road. They do not look at the 2 tigers idling like beasts outside a burning barn. They keep working because they are on orders larger than fear. For long seconds, Peiper cannot move. The blaze has stopped time. A thought arrives without invitation. If the enemy can afford to burn this, what can't he afford? The question has no answer, only an echo. Gruber scrambles up beside him, face red from heat, eyes wet from the fumes. "If we rush them," he starts. Peiper shakes his head before he knows he is doing it. Heat alone would kill a company. Ammunition inside the depot cooks off in staccato bursts. A stack of cans collapses with the sound of a cathedral roof giving way. Flame pushes 100 feet into the air and wobbles in the wind, a living thing that breathes gasoline. On the far edge of the depot, a platoon of American riflemen appears from a drainage cut, faces black with soot. One turns, sees the column on the road, and simply points at the fire. An unmistakable gesture that needs no language. Not for you. A howitzer shell lands short in the snow and throws up a pillar of grey. An American machine gun chatters at nothing, more warning than battle. The engineers keep lighting. A corporal drags a fuel pipe like a dead snake and pours a shining trail toward another untouched pyramid. A private kneels and strikes a match on his helmet rim. The tiny flame blossoms to a sun. The blaze becomes a wall. It becomes a fact. Men in German uniforms who have counted liters for 2 years watch enemy soldiers pour rivers of fuel into fire and understand, to the marrow, that arithmetic governs history. The heat drives them back down the road. Radiators boil, carburetors cough. One Panther dies and will not restart. The crew swears and kicks snow against the tracks as if snow could put out math. Peiper's radio snarls. Reports from forward scouts, from rear guards, from nowhere and everywhere. Road blocked. Bridges mined. Fuel convoy delayed. Words like frostbite. His driver glances up through smoke-red glass. Herr Obersturmbannführer? Peiper grips the cupola ring until his gloves harden with heat. We wait, he says, voice flat. Waiting burns less fuel than deciding. The engineers finish their work with professional indifference. They withdraw into the smoke without triumph, as men who have done a hard job well and will sleep. Behind them, Stavelot burns for 3 days. The column waits hours for the fire to blow sideways and open the road by sheer violence of weather. When at last they inch past, Peiper stands in the turret, eyes watering. Inside the depot fence, millions of gallons roar into a sky already the color of defeat. The column rolls west. The road narrows to a thread. Snow deepens. Fuel gauges tick down like clocks in a sick room. Every mile is a calculation. Every calculation ends the same. At Trois Ponts, an American engineer battalion drops the bridge into the river as the first Tiger comes into view. The span folds like a deck of cards and vanishes with a single sighing splash. The river takes it and closes its black mouth over steel. On the far bank, engineers stack more jerry cans in a casual wall and light them without looking back. Smoke grinds low to the ground. All day the wind writes geography out of soot. From a farmhouse cellar they turn into a command post. On a trestle table sits a GI field phone and a pile of Stars and Stripes newspapers. A private who once ran an import business in Bremen reads the English headlines aloud, each word a hammer on an anvil. New pipeline, Cherbourg to Verdun. 300,000 gallons daily. Another line to Paris. Numbers, dates, arrows on maps printed with the serene confidence of people who live inside abundance. The men listen until listening hurts and then ask him to stop. Peiper says nothing. He takes one paper and folds it into his map case as if it were a document he might need to produce when someone asks him later where the war ended. The road climbs. The fuel falls. They fight small battles at the price of large gallons. At Stoumont, they take a crossroads and lose an hour to a jam of their own making. A Panther runs dry in the intersection and locks the column like a key in a door. Drivers curse, crews push, officers blow whistles as if order can push gasoline into tanks. When at last they clear it, dusk has gathered like rumor. Night comes with fog. Men walk beside the vehicles to listen for misfires. Someone stumbles and opens a palm on frozen gravel. Blood looks black under blackout lamps. A Tiger's engine note wobbles, steadies, falters, steadies, like a sick man's breath. The driver nurses it like a child. Behind the column, far behind, American trucks move along parallel roads in rivers, their headlights hooded, their engines content. They burn fuel to deliver fuel. They leak fuel to move fuel. They forgive waste because waste is cheaper than interruption. They do not know that the men they face count gallons the way a drowning man counts breaths. Morning again, and with it the cold. An aide tallies the battalion's fuel remaining on the back of a ration box with a carpenter's pencil. The numbers tilt downhill like a bad roof. 8,000 gallons, he reports, maybe. The maybe is larger than the number. Peiper calls his company commanders to a ditch and speaks without rhetoric. We can reach the Meuse, or we can fight here, he says. We cannot do both. They stare at the map, at the road that looks so short on paper and so endless in snow. One captain says, "The Americans burned more yesterday than we have today." Another says nothing and watches his breath. A third asks for permission to siphon a disabled half-track. He is already holding a length of rubber hose. Peiper nods. Men learn quickly when the lesson is gasoline. They push again. Radio intercept warns, Allied aircraft will fly when the sky clears. It clears at noon, like a trapdoor. P-47s arrive low and hungry, their radial engines writing thunder over the fields. Rockets fold trucks, 50 caliber streams comb the ditches, and tanks that would have fought back in another year hunch their shoulders and hope. The Jabos burn what the engineers did not. By dusk, the spearhead is down to fumes. A clerk counts cans out loud, as if numbers could thicken the liquid inside. 4, he says. Then 2. Then 1. And then the noise of pouring stops. The last can rings empty with a small, comic sound that no one finds funny. They consolidate at Le Glaise, the village houses huddled like animals in cold. The order is simple. Pool fuel, feed what can still move, prepare for either miracle or retreat. Mechanics crawl under hulls with icy wrenches. Men siphon by mouth and spit gasoline into bottles, eyes watering, lips numb. A tiger coughs, catches, coughs again, and dies as if reconsidering life. The crew looks at one another the way men do when a plan ends. A runner arrives with a radio message. A fuel convoy from the east has been hit, burned on the road, blackened cans bursting along the ditch like corn over a campfire. No resupply. Continue with available resources. The sentence reads like a parody of war. Peiper walks alone behind the church and lights a cigarette he cannot taste. The sky is clear. He can see the smoke from Stavelot still, a gray bruise against the sun. He remembers the American officer raising his arm and does not resent him. He envies him. Command is easy when the world beneath your feet is made of pipelines. He goes back inside and tells his staff, "We use what remains to hold. If we try to run, we die tired." No one argues. They have seen the arithmetic. Night in Le Glaise tastes like iron. German soldiers stand sentry beside tanks that have become sculptures. They listen to distant engines that do not belong to them. Across the valley, American headlights string along a ridge like a necklace, then go dark, then reappear in another place, as if roads themselves are multiplying. On the third day, the fuel is a rumor. Men are given tasks that do not require engines. Dig, wire, sight, pray. A letter from higher command arrives to say that help is coming. It reads as if written weeks earlier and forwarded through time. Men pass it hand to hand anyway because paper is warm. Clear weather returns with cruelty. The Yabos come again. After the second pass, a Tiger crew climbs up and opens their engine deck. They stare into the dry throat of the Maybach as if looking into a well that has forgotten water. The loader sits on the track and eats snow with a spoon. He says he is drinking, and no one corrects him. By evening, Peiper has the last conversation of the offensive with his company leaders. It is short. "We will abandon the vehicles tonight," he says. The words strike the room like a dropped wrench. A captain who has slept in his turret for 2 years swallows hard and asks, "All?" Peiper nods. "All. We burn what will burn and blow what will not." The silence that follows is heavier than steel. They work by touch and whispered numbers, charges under breach rings, thermite on transmissions, grenades in fuel lines that have carried too little for too long. The village shakes with dull, embarrassed thumps. A Tiger's gun tube droops as if ashamed. Before he pulls the igniter on his command tank, Peiper stands one last time in the turret and looks east, and then west. The cold gets into his lungs and makes him cough. He thinks of a depot that burned not because war is cruel, but because someone could afford cruelty measured in millions. He thinks, more dimly, of a desk somewhere far away, where a man initialed a request for 100 million gallons, and someone else stamped it, approved. He climbs down and lights the cord. The tank takes fire with a thick, bored sound. Flames lick at the turret ring. Paint blisters. Ammunition pops like damp wood. The crew steps back together and does not look at each other. They leave La Glaise on foot, boots scraping on ice, weapons slung. The road narrowing to a path that smells of smoke and arithmetic. Behind them, the silhouettes of their tanks glow and then fade, and then become dark shapes against darker trees. Across the valley, American engines idle. Someone on the far ridge laughs at a joke that has nothing to do with war, and everything to do with being warm. At dawn, frost has sugared the wrecks. A patrol from the 30th Infantry wanders among them, touching cold armor and reading stenciled numbers with mittened fingers. A private sticks his head into a Tiger's fighting compartment and whistles. "Hell of a car," he says, as if in a showroom. His sergeant taps the fuel gauge with a knuckle. The needle rests hard on 0. "Hell of a habit," he answers. Word travels quickly. Encircled Germans slipped away in the night, leaving 39 runners and 70 half-tracks because the gauges were honest. The American captain writes it up, drinks hot coffee that tastes faintly of gasoline, and moves on to the next task in a war organized like a factory. Later that day, a supply clerk at First Army notes the ledger. Fuel received yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Issued 1,623,000. Net to reserve, 224,000. The numbers sit on the page like a shrug. He does not know he has written an epitaph. And far behind the lines, in a port where cranes never sleep, fresh drums swing from slings and thump onto waiting flatbeds, each stamped with a home thousands of miles away. Texas, Louisiana. The drums do not know where they are. They know only the gravity of movement. Back in the snow, a German corporal finishes a letter to his wife by the light of a candle stub. He writes that they ran out of fuel and walked away from tanks that could have saved them. He writes that the Americans burned 2 million gallons to deny them a mile. He does not write that he understood the war at Stavelot, because there is no room left on the paper, and because the truth fits better in silence. Peiper reaches the forest line and looks back once. Smoke hangs over the valley like a bruise that will not heal. He feels no drama, only subtraction. The offensive began with a barrage and ends with a ledger. Courage has not changed. The units have not changed. The arithmetic has.
He adjusts the strap on his machine pistol and steps into the trees. The snow squeaks. The column of men becomes a file, and then a thread, and then a rumor. Their engines are gone. Their war now weighs what a man can carry. The America they fought remains in the air, a smell of burned fuel that will cling to clothes until spring. Somewhere to the west, a pipeline pumps steadily. Somewhere to the east, a refinery does not. The fire at Stavelot burns itself into memory and then burns out. The road remains, grey and ordinary, as if it never held a lesson. But the men who saw engineers set a match to oceans will carry that lesson long after they forget the names of crossroads. They learned that morning that you can be brave and precise and doomed. They learned that a nation can measure victory in gallons and win. They learned that a tank without fuel is a statue, and a statue is a promise kept to no one. The snow begins again, soft as ash. It covers tracks and wrecks and footprints and arithmetic. It does not cover the smell. And then the sky grows quiet, in the way skies do after something has ended, and the only sound left is the low, patient murmur of engines far away that will never run out. When the fires of Stavelot died down, the snow returned, covering everything in a white lie. Burned cans became dark spots under the drifts. Charred tanks became shapes in the fog. From above, the battlefield looked calm again, clean, almost beautiful. But beneath that calm was arithmetic, working like frost in iron, splitting everything that had once seemed solid. By the end of December 1944, the German army was no longer an army in motion. It was a museum of immobilized ideas. Across the Ardennes, hundreds of tanks stood with engines intact, ammunition loaded, and fuel gauges reading 0. They were not destroyed. They were subtracted. The lesson of Honsfeld and Stavelot spread through the Wehrmacht like a fever. Field reports that had once catalogued enemy fire now catalogued absence. No gasoline, no convoy, no movement. General von Manteuffel wrote later, "When I learned that the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons to deny us, I knew the offensive was over before it began." Every officer who had seen the infernos understood the same truth. This was not a failure of bravery or strategy. It was a failure of math. In Berlin, Albert Speer tried to explain it in memos that read like obituaries for the modern age. "The enemy fights with a fuel supply that renews itself faster than we can consume it," he wrote. "Every bombing of our plants doubles the advantage of his system." He called it self-repairing abundance. Germany's own abundance had been an illusion, an empire of precision built on scarcity disguised as genius. The factories of Krupp and Henschel could build tanks of remarkable power, but each one consumed 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile it advanced. The more tanks they produced, the faster they starved. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, American factories didn't innovate for perfection, they innovated for quantity. In 1944, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany managed 33 million. That number, 2%, was the measure of everything. 2% of oil, 2% of chance. The Allies didn't just produce fuel, they produced the means to deliver it. Pipelines under oceans, convoys of 10,000 trucks, depots that could refill an entire division overnight. When an American commander needed 245 million gallons for January operations, the request wasn't debated. It was stamped, filed, approved. German officers captured after the Ardennes spoke of this with a mixture of awe and disgust.
One colonel said during interrogation, "Your soldiers pour gasoline into the mud when it spills."
We measure by the spoon.
Another, a logistics officer named Ernst Müller, wrote home before capture, "The Americans wash their hands in gasoline and drive tanks like taxis. We walk to war." The arrogance that had powered the Blitzkrieg died there, among empty fuel tanks. The myth of the master race couldn't survive the sight of Americans burning millions of gallons, simply to deny them a day's advance. Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to explain it as decadence. The Americans are soft, they waste what they cannot earn. But waste, it turned out, was another word for surplus. Germany's virtues, discipline, precision, efficiency, were meaningless against an enemy who could afford inefficiency and win anyway. In letters and diaries, the shock reads like scripture. Corporal Karl Reichhelm wrote, "They throw away what we would guard with our lives.
Their waste is our hunger."
Private Wilhelm Hoffmann described American convoys as an ocean of trucks that never ends. He added, "We were fighting the ocean itself." That phrase, "fighting the ocean," became shorthand among prisoners. The Wehrmacht had measured war in kilometers and victories. The Americans measured it in tons, barrels, and man-hours. Field Marshal Keitel testified after the war, "We had the superior officers, the superior training, perhaps even the superior men. But they had the superior industry." After 1943, there was no competition. We fought machines with courage, and found that courage burns faster. What happened at Stavelot and Honsfeld wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a revelation. The moment when Germany's leaders and soldiers alike understood that the age of the warrior was ending. The new god of war was the assembly line. In Houston, Standard Oil refined high-octane fuel for bombers. In Detroit, Ford built tank engines faster than Germany could assemble pistons. In Pennsylvania, chemists mixed lubricants that could survive Arctic cold and tropical heat. Every American city became a fortress of production. By late 1944, the American logistical network was not a system. It was an ecosystem. Losses repaired themselves. Every destroyed truck had 3 replacements en route. Every burned pipeline was rebuilt before its smoke cleared. Even inefficiency became a weapon. It didn't matter how much was wasted, because the supply was infinite compared to the demand. A German intelligence report intercepted in January 1945 captured the despair. The Americans operate in a state of permanent redundancy. They can lose everything today and rebuild it by tomorrow. And it wasn't just quantity, it was integration. Every vehicle, from Jeep to Sherman tank, used standardized fuel and parts. The German army, by contrast, operated more than 100 different vehicle types requiring dozens of fuel grades and spare parts. Efficiency had turned into chaos. When American soldiers captured Le Glaise, they found 39 intact German tanks abandoned, simply for lack of gasoline. A logistics officer in Patton's Third Army wrote in his report, "Fuel required to recover, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve." The fuel to save an entire German armored column was a rounding error in an American ledger. Peiper's name appeared in several intelligence summaries afterward, always beside the same note: "Ran out of fuel." Historians later wrote about the massacres, the battles, the weather. But the real cause of his defeat could fit on a single line of a supply chart. The Americans didn't just win battles, they won reality. Every destroyed depot, every burning truck convoy, was instantly replaced. They could build faster than anyone could kill. In January 1945, Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons of fuel for the upcoming offensive into Germany. The order was approved without argument. Meanwhile, Speer's last functioning refinery at Leuna produced 5,000 tons that month, less than a single day of Allied air operations consumed. By February, the Luftwaffe was grounded. Fighter pilots trained in wooden mock-ups because there was no gasoline for actual flight. The German Navy had ceased surface operations entirely. Panzer divisions sat in barns while their commanders wrote to Berlin, begging for diesel. The contrast was obscene. Patton's Third Army used 350,000 gallons just to pivot north during the Bulge. 3 days of movement, powered by more fuel than the entire SS Panzer Corps had received for the offensive. In the end, this wasn't just a contest between armies. It was a confrontation between eras. Germany fought the 20th century's last romantic war. America fought its first industrial one. The outcome was never in doubt once the refineries were running. By the time spring came, the Reich's generals no longer pretended. Orders were still given, battles still fought, but the war had moved beyond them, into the realm of production statistics and supply schedules. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld became a parable whispered through German ranks. The soldiers called it the day the tiger died. Not because of his tank, but because the symbol itself, the armored fist of the Reich, had frozen solid. Albert Speer wrote later, "The fate of Germany was sealed not at Stalingrad or Normandy, but at Honsfeld." When an officer realized that the Americans could abandon 50,000 gallons without thought, he understood the war's geometry. That geometry was simple. The U.S. Army consumed 7.5 million gallons daily, received 8.2, and built reserves even while fighting. Germany's offensive consumed 2.8 million, nearly all it had, and captured less than 2% of that number. Every comparison was obscene. The Americans produced 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. Germany produced 1 every hour. The Americans built 88,000 tanks. Germany, 46,000. The Americans refined 50 times more oil. The math was the war. And in that math lay a deeper truth. The industrial world had reached the point where courage and genius were no longer decisive. In the ruins of La Glaise, American soldiers sipped coffee brewed over gasoline stoves, while German prisoners shivered and stared at the steam. One GI offered a cup to a captured lieutenant. The German took it, hands trembling, and whispered, "You burn fuel to make coffee. We died for it." The GI didn't answer. He couldn't. There was nothing to say. The empire of fuel had already won. It was not a country, or a flag, or a general. It was a process. It was motion itself. It was the power to move, to replace, to waste, and still advance. By the time the snow melted, the tigers were rusting monuments to an old idea, that strength alone could master the world. They stood mute under a new sky that belonged not to soldiers, but to engineers, to the men who had turned oil into victory. The war of movement had ended in stillness, and the stillness was filled with engines idling somewhere beyond sight. May 1945. The guns have stopped, but the smoke still drifts like memory. Across Germany, the roads are silent except for the sound of engines that no longer need to hurry. The war has slowed to a crawl of paperwork, surrenders, photographs. The sky is still streaked with contrails, but even they fade faster now. At a field near Remagen, rows of German armor sit abandoned, their once proud silhouettes rusting under drizzle. Tiger, Panther, King Tiger, all magnificent, all useless. Mechanics from Patton's Third Army walk among them,
touching the cold armor with a kind of curiosity, as if exploring the skeleton of an extinct animal. One bends to look at a fuel gauge. It points to 0. He taps the glass and laughs. All this for nothing, he mutters, then moves on. Somewhere to the west, trains are running again. They carry not troops, but fuel. Endless tank cars heading east to feed the occupation armies. The smell of oil, hot metal, and diesel smoke still clings to Europe like an aftertaste. Peiper is alive, though barely. Captured, interrogated, sentenced. His eyes are hollow. In prison, years later, he will tell a historian, "Finding that depot was the worst thing that happened to me. We discovered the scale of the world." He will never speak of the fire at Stavelot, but he will remember the sound it made, the hiss of millions of gallons burning, the heartbeat of the empire that beat his own to death. Time moves. The ruins are rebuilt. The roads are repaved. The noise of peace slowly replaces the noise of war. But the arithmetic remains. By 1950, American oil companies are producing even more than during the war. Cars, planes, ships. The fuel that once won battles now powers suburban mornings. Germany rebuilds too, this time with American steel, American dollars, American fuel. The same petroleum that once burned it now keeps it alive. And then, decades later, 1984, the Ardennes are quiet again. The forests have healed, the fields have forgotten, or pretend to. In the small Belgian town of La Glaise, tourists gather around a museum courtyard. There, under the soft grey sky, stands the Tiger tank that couldn't move. It hasn't been cleaned much. Moss climbs its tracks. Rain has dulled its armor to the color of old bone. On this day, 2 old men stand before it, one in an American overcoat, the other in a simple civilian suit. They are strangers until someone introduces them. The American is Roy Anderson, once of the 30th Infantry Division. The German is Karl Wortmann, former tank mechanic of Kampfgruppe Peiper. They look at the machine together, silent for a long time. Anderson breaks first. "We always wondered why you stopped," he says. "We thought it was tactical." Wortmann's smile is thin. "No," he says. "We stopped because she was empty." He gestures toward the tank. "Fuel." The American frowns, trying to find something to say. "We had so much," he admits quietly. "We never even thought about it." The German nods. That was the difference. A tour guide begins to speak to a small crowd, telling the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the desperate push, the captured depots, the burning of millions of gallons. People listen politely, take photographs, and move on. The old men stay behind. Wortmann rests a hand on the Tiger's cold flank. "She was perfect," he says. "Every bolt, every weld. But perfection needs fuel." Anderson looks at the horizon, at the green fields where convoys once rolled like rivers. "We didn't have perfection," he says. "Just a lot of everything." "Enough," Wortmann says. "Yes," Anderson replies. "Enough." They shake hands awkwardly, and for a moment the years vanish. 2 soldiers, 2 survivors of the same equation. As the crowd disperses, the guide closes the museum doors. Evening falls. The Tiger sits alone again. The last light of the sun glints on its gun barrel, and then fades. Inside, its gauges are frozen at 0, its engine block filled with rust. The war left it here as a monument, not to victory or defeat, but to measurement. To the weight of gallons, tons, and hours, the units that decide the fate of nations. In the quiet, the forest breathes.
Birds nest in the barrel of the cannon. Children's voices echo down the road. Somewhere far away, a jet crosses the sky, a descendant of the age that began here. Its engines fed by the same fuel that once defined life and death. History keeps its own irony. The men who fought for oil left behind a world that can't live without it.
The Tiger tank stands still, caught between memory and myth.
Its fuel gauge still reads empty, but its meaning is full. The end of courage without supply. The death of the warrior's age. They fought for gallons. America fought with oceans. And in the arithmetic of empires, the side that can waste wins. The evening air cools. The tank is silent. Only the faint hum of a passing car, its engine smooth, effortless, endless, breaks the quiet. It sounds, for just a moment, like history breathing in. Then even that sound fades. The war is over. The math remains.